Hi everyone, it's Dr. G. Welcome back to the Sociology Experience. In this video, I'd like to talk about social inequalities, prejudice, and discrimination. So let's start with a definition. Social inequality refers to the resources in a given society that are distributed unevenly, typically through norms of allocation that engender specific patterns along lines of socially defined categories of persons. In other words, social inequality refers to the lack of equality of access to opportunity that can be based upon a person's power, religion, kinship, prestige, race, ethnicity, gender, age, sexual orientation, and class. It's truly all about power. Let's continue with some more definitions. A majority, also called a dominant group, refers to the group with the most power, greatest privileges, and highest social status, whereas a minority or subordinate group refers to people who are singled out for unequal treatment and who regard themselves as objects of collective discrimination. I want to add that the term minority does not necessarily mean minority in number. And an example would be women. Women make up more than 50% of the population, but women are still considered a minority group. Let's take a look at some of the dominant and subordinate groups in the US. Some dominant groups include men, Caucasians, English speakers, Christians, heterosexuals, and the well-to-do. Some subordinate groups include women, people of color, speakers of other languages, non-Christians, members of the LGBT community, and the not-so-rich. Dominant group members often believe that their privileged position, if they even recognize that they are privileged, is due to its own innate superiority. Anthropologists Charles Wagley and Marvin Harris identified 5 characteristics shared by minorities worldwide. Number 1, membership in a minority group is an ascribed status. It's not voluntary. Number 2, the physical or cultural traits that distinguish minorities are held in low esteem by the dominant group. Number 3, minorities are unequally treated by the dominant group. Number 4, minorities tend to marry within their own group. And number 5, minorities tend to feel strong group solidarity. Let's look at another term. Prejudice is a rigid and unfair generalization about an entire category of people. In other words, prejudice is a prejudging of some sort, usually in a negative way. Prejudice is an attitude. Discrimination refers to treating various categories of people unequally. In other words, discrimination is unfair treatment directed against someone. It is action. There are 2 forms of discrimination, individual and institutional. Individual discrimination refers to the negative treatment of one person by another, while institutional discrimination refers to how discrimination is woven into the fabric of society and within institutions such as schools, the criminal justice system, hospitals, politics, and the workplace. Institutional discrimination is pervasive in our institutions. Let's talk a little bit more about prejudice. And I'd like to share a very short little story with you. Let me read. Perhaps you have noticed that people who are prejudiced against one racial or ethnic group are likely to be prejudiced against other groups. This principle was strikingly illustrated by the research of psychologist Eugene Hartley, who asked people how they felt about various racial and ethnic groups. Besides Blacks, Jews, and so on, his list included the Wallonians, the Peronians, and the Danaronians, names that he had made up. Most people who expressed dislike for Jews and Blacks also expressed dislike for these three fictional groups. The significance of Hartley's study is that prejudice does not depend on negative experiences with others. People can be and are prejudiced against people they have never met, and even against groups that do not exist. So where does prejudice come from? I'm going to take a look at some theories in psychology and in sociology. Let's start with psychology, frustration and scapegoats. In 1939, psychologist John Dullard found that people who are unable to strike out at the real source of their frustrations, let's say, for example, low wages, find someone else to blame. They view this scapegoat, which is defined as the group that they unfairly blame for their troubles, as having few good traits. And then we have the authoritarian personality. Psychologist Theodore Adorno found that highly prejudiced people have authoritarian personalities and rank high on conformity, intolerance, insecurity, respect for authority, and submissiveness to superiors. While psychologists stress that prejudice is an internal state of individuals, sociologists focus on how some environments foster prejudice while others reduce it. Let's take a look at structural functionalism that says that prejudice, one of the products of pitting group against group and I win, you lose situations, is functional in that it creates in-group solidarity and out-group antagonisms. Social conflict theory shows us that when pitted against one another, racial and ethnic groups, men and women, heterosexuals and LGBTQ members, Christians and non-Christians, learn to distrust one another instead of recognizing their common interest. And symbolic interaction theory focuses on how perceptions and labels produce prejudice. Through labels, people look at the members of a group and though they were all alike, as if they were all alike. Symbolic interactionists stress that no one is born prejudiced. We learn it. Finally, I want to bring up a term, xenophobia, which refers to the fear of what is strange. It is important that we have open minds and are willing to socialize with those who are different than ourselves. It is important for us to implement critical thinking and look around at people that are different than us and to not be afraid of them, but to learn about them and see that they, much like ourselves, have many things that are in common. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you back very soon. Bye-bye.